All right. Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us during your lunch hour for this webinar where we're really excited to share our newest resource from the Hill Country Alliance, Model HOA Language for the Texas Hill Country. This is meant to be a practical guide for protecting and preserving water resources, native landscapes, and night skies. This resource was really inspired by our grassroots partners on the ground that were working with communities to promote water conservation and reduce light pollution, especially in unincorporated areas of the county of the region. Counties don't have as many authorities as cities to guide development with things like water-wise landscaping ordinances, or they don't have the ability to do things like require certain land get set aside. But in these areas where counties have fewer authorities, HOAs have a lot of influence over things like landscaping and lighting. And so our grassroots partners wanted a resource that they could present to HOAs and new developments to help them voluntarily put in place landscape and lighting requirements to help preserve our region's natural resources. This guide is really focused on landscapes and landscaping because landscapes, both in homes and in common areas, can have such an impact on water use, lighting, and local flora and fauna. It doesn't touch on other important aspects of development, things like site planning or shrinking the envelope of disturbance. It is really focused on HOAs and landscapes, and especially the landscape guideline document. I want to acknowledge up front that we know this guide is going to change over time, and we really look forward to getting it, seeing it get put to work and learning from those that are actually implementing it on the ground to see how we can make it better. So over the next 40 minutes, I'm going to be going over the different sections of our guide as they are now. And then at the end, we'll turn it over to some Q&A. Amanda Griffin and Karen Brewitt were two of the co-authors with me on this guide, and so they'll be here too for Q&A. The webinar and Q&A will be recorded, as I mentioned in the beginning. So if there are questions, you feel free to say outside of the recording, feel free to email me and we can have that conversation offline. With that, let's get started. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the Hill Country Alliance, we're a regional nonprofit working across 17 counties in the Hill Country. We do a lot of work with local partners to protect the night skies, land, water, and unique character of our region. And we're really lucky that we get to work in such a special region. 12 of the state's rivers have their headwaters in the Hill Country. We have the prolific Edwards Aquifer, which is the main drinking water supply for many communities, including San Antonio. We also have the Trinity Aquifer, which I always love to spotlight because it doesn't get as much attention, but it is the drinking water source for many, many communities like Bandera, for example, and Kerrville. We are also lucky to have amazing night skies. You have folks that in other parts of the country have never seen the Milky Way, and we're so lucky that we still have views of the Milky Way here in the Hill Country. As our night skies program manager, Dawn, loves to say, we're on the edge of night here. You can see on this map just how much more light there is in this eastern part of the United States, and kind of coming right down this middle with what looks like a line, we see more darkness out to the west, and we're right around here. For those of you enjoying wildflower season, you know we have a lot of native plants and animals that are local to the region that are just so beautiful throughout the year. And of course, they're beautiful waters, many of them pristine, these crystal clear blue waters that are so unique across the nation. And so it should be no surprise with all these amazing resources that we're seeing so much growth in the Hill Country, especially along the I-35 corridor. This is a great chart from the San Antonio Express News that was looking at change in population in the Hill Country over the last 20 years. And you can see that in the sort of I-35 corridor counties, you have a near doubling of population over the last 20 years. And what that means is that our landscape is being transformed. This is another excerpt from San Antonio Express News. I thought it was so interesting to see, for example, the city of Buda, that just 20 years ago, this patch of land that might have been open landscapes is now much more developed. And when we see this sort of growth and this sort of development, what that can mean is more impervious cover that can impede recharge and exacerbate stormwater runoff. We see more of those metaphorical straws in the ground, so more pressure on our water supplies. we see more light, and we see a lot more site grading. So folks coming in and clearing our native landscapes to make room for growth. And so we have a lot of change coming to the hill country. A lot of this change is also happening in unincorporated areas of our region. So I mentioned at the beginning that it was our grassroots partners in unincorporated areas that first asked for this resource. In that incorporated areas of the hill country, we're seeing in some places almost a tripling of population in the last 30 years, right? And again, these are parts of the region where counties don't have the same tools as cities to guide development. And for those of you wondering, this is from a report from spring 2022, our State of the Hill Country report that we did as part of the Texas Hill Country Conservation Network with many other partners working in our region. And so we've got all this growth, and we're also in the midst of one of the most acute droughts on record. This is the drought monitor from last week. It shows almost a bullseye right over central Texas, where we are now in a declared exceptional drought. Over the last 3 years, we've seen almost a 24-inch rainfall deficit from what we normally would have gotten. And so we also are in this drought that many are starting to call, I think, our new drought of record for parts of this region. And we're seeing the impacts of that drought and that growth in our water supplies and our water resources. This is a chart from 2023 that shows average inflows to the Highland Lakes or Lakes Buchanan and Travis over time. The blue is average inflow from the 40s to 2022, the light blue. The dark blue was the average during the drought of 2011. And the purple is what we were seeing in 2023. And you can see that in August of 2023, we got down to almost zero inflows into Lakes Buchanan and Lakes Travis. In our groundwater, we're seeing that reflected too. We're seeing year-on-year declines. This is a well in western Kerr County in the Trinity Aquifer. They've seen since 2006, so around 20 years, around 25 feet of decline in that section of the aquifer. And this is pretty common for many of these state wells that are tracking aquifer levels over time across our region. I want to flag, for those of you not from Kerr County, you can see more localized aquifer levels over time at waterDataForTexas.org. They have automated groundwater wells. It's managed by the Water Development Board. It's a great resource to see how our groundwater resources are changing over time. And lastly, it's not just numbers and inflows. We can see the impacts of this drought really on our landscape. This is a photo of a dry Jacobs well. It's predicted to be dry now for the 4th summer, this coming summer in a row. This is a well that had, over historic times, gone dry very few times, and now we're in our 4th year of probably closed Jacobs well. A well that is so special and so amazing, or a spring that is so special and so amazing. So we're seeing these impacts, and I'm saying all this not to inspire nightmares, but because I want to provide a framing for the context that we are all living in right now. So why do we care about HOAs within this context? Well, there are a lot of HOAs in Texas. There was an estimate that there's 22,000 HOAs, and that includes a lot of people, 6 million people living in them. After federal, state, and county or municipal law, an HOA's governing documents are the next highest level of authority. So they can really shape or help shape development. We see this as an opportunity for HOA governing documents to promote landscapes that preserve native flora, fauna, water, and night skies. I mentioned at the beginning, we're really focused on landscapes with this guide. And the reason for that is that landscapes are, first and foremost, a major consumer of our potable water. There's a lot of statistics out there. The Water Development Board says that 30% of annual residential water use goes to outdoor water, but we know from speaking to many local water managers that they see those numbers go up to 60 to 70% during the summer. That is a lot of potable water going to our landscapes. We also know that our local pollinators need local native plants, right? And so there's an important role for landscapes to play in supporting our local ecosystems. And then lastly, as development expands, it can often unintentionally increase the spread of light pollution, and that includes with our landscape lighting. There are examples of, uplighting, shining up at trees. And so there's an opportunity to think about our landscape lighting too. And beyond the sort of ecological and resource benefits, there are good reasons for homeowners to think about low impact landscapes. And I'll just pause and say, I'm using the word low impact instead of native and adapted, which is often what we use when we talk about xeriscaping, because we're going beyond just xeriscaping drought tolerant landscapes. We're also talking about lighting. So low impact landscapes. And what are those benefits to homeowners? Well, when you have drought tolerant and adapted species, you can see big water savings. So you're doing your part when it comes to water conservation, but that's also reflected in your bill. So folks that have more drought tolerant landscapes are seeing savings on their water bills over time. These landscapes can be easier to upkeep. We know from many folks, even in cities, that when you have drought tolerant landscapes, you save on maintenance costs over time from not having to replace plants that haven't been able to survive some of these droughts. And you also have increased curb appeal and property values. There was a study from the city of Las Vegas that looked at how properties with standard green turf lawns compared to properties that had xeriscaping, diverse landscapes. And what they found was that properties with these xeriscape landscapes, these drought tolerant, diverse landscapes, on average had a 6 to 8% higher property value. And when you do have HOA landscape guidelines or HOAs playing a role in how the landscape is shaped, you get something that looks really specific to our region. This is a great example of the Frieden development. It's outside of Fredericksburg. They have used their landscape guidelines to guide the sorts of plants and landscapes that homeowners can put in place. So for example, turf areas are limited to 50% of the total front yard, and they've gone ahead and said that the grasses that are used must be drought tolerant and that folks can't use Bermuda or St. Augustine grass. In contrast, right, we also too see these sorts of developments. This is an example from a large national builder that's building in the Hill Country and the sort of home options that they have. Um, this is really common for folks that aren't from our region and are building at scale. And these sorts of developments certainly have a place, but they're not necessarily regionally adapted to our region. The example from their guidelines is, for example, front yard and rear yard must be fully sodded except for landscape beds. And the landscape irrigation system must be installed for the entire front yard. We think that something like this could be an opportunity to think about how these guidelines might be changed to help homeowners think about their landscaping differently. Another example of guidelines that might be an opportunity for change is when it comes to outdoor lighting. We see lots of developments that have actually in place really great landscaping guidelines and are promoting drought tolerant plants, but they also have outdoor lighting requirements for uplighting trees or having floodlight fixtures. And so there's some opportunities there with outdoor lighting as well. In 2013, the legislature passed a change to the property code that made it unlawful for HOAs to enforce any provision of your deed restriction that would ban xeriscaping or rainwater harvesting or composting. So there was a law that was changed, and in response, many HOAs did go ahead and file xeriscaping policies at the county. So they worked with their lawyer and they figured out what changes needed to be made in order to clarify the sorts of drought tolerant landscapes and irrigation systems and rainwater harvesting systems that they wanted to see in their development. And really many developments did do this, but there are some developments that haven't. And so this guide is not just for new developments, but also for existing developments that are looking to file a landscaping policy change and update their guidelines. And so our goals in creating this guide, right, with this context of HOAs have this role to play, right, was to make it easier for new developments to adopt landscaping policies that help preserve the water, wildlife, and night skies of our region, and to provide a template for hill country HOAs that have not yet filed as area-scaping policy or are contemplating updates. This was a tremendous effort with a lot of supporters. Like I mentioned, Karen and Amanda were the co-authors on this, but we had several entities review this to make sure that the recommendations we were putting forth were in line with, sort of best practices right now with from a conservation perspective. And we had a legal review done by Chris Law that works with a lot of HOAs to make sure we were putting forth recommendations that were in fact legal. And with all that, I still need to make a few disclaimers. First, this is a living document that will be updated over time. We know and are expecting that there will be changes once this document is actually put to work. And I encourage you all to reach out as you're learning and putting and implementing this. The second disclaimer is that we have a lot of different kinds of developments all over the hill country, from tiny home subdivisions with very little, front yards and backyards to 10-acre ranchettes with a lot more landscaping. And so, it would have been pretty much impossible to do guidelines that were perfect for every sort of development. And so I hope that you will think of these as a starting point. And then the last thing is I want to acknowledge there are a lot of great examples out there already from conservation developments that are doing great work. And we borrowed and took inspiration from a lot of these HOAs and developments that are already conservation minded. And so we're definitely not inventing something new, but we are pulling together from a lot of different resources to create this document. I'm about to jump into the document, which I've kept promising, but I want to make sure we're all clear on the difference between CC&Rs and landscape guidelines, because those are the two sections, the two main sections of our resource. So covenants, conditions, and restrictions, CC&Rs, are legally binding documents that outline property restrictions within development. The key difference for the purpose of our guide is that they are very difficult to change. To change a deed restriction that's in the CC&Rs, right, requires approval from 2/3 usually of property owners, and it's really hard to get that many property owners to vote, especially in a very large subdivision. Landscape guidelines are also provide rules and guidance specifically for landscaping, but usually, depending on how the CC&Rs are written, can be changed with either majority approval from the board or majority approval from the committee in charge of actually developing those guidelines. That's not to say that they should be changed willy-nilly without any involvement from members and residents. We definitely recommend a transparent process and include some ideas of how to do that, but it is easier to get over that hurdle of the 2/3 vote, where usually the issue isn't necessarily a lack of will, but just a difficulty in getting those votes altogether. So our guide has three main sections. The first is CC&R best practices. The second is model language for your landscape guidelines. And the last is implementation. The first section is really going to be most helpful to new developments that have the opportunity to set up their CC&Rs up front and to set them up their landscape guidelines up for success. This is not model language in the way our landscape guidelines are, because CC&Rs, they're a robust legal document that you're going to need help from your lawyer on. So instead, think of this section as tips and tricks and best practices that you should work with your lawyer on. And the first practice that we recommend is to set a goal of preserving and enhancing the property's natural resources in your CC&Rs. It's really helpful to be able to refer to this document down the line and say, hey, our development has a goal of preserving and enhancing our natural resources, and that's why we want to promote, for example, native plants or drought-tolerant plants. Another recommended practice is to create a committee outside of the board focused on landscape improvements and granting that committee the authority to adapt to landscaping best practices. So if you're in an HOA, it's very likely that the committee in charge of updating your landscape guidelines is either is the Architectural Control Committee, or maybe it's your board. We recommend in our resource thinking about a landscape design committee that is focused exclusively on landscaping, because it is so different from the other sorts of architectural control or architectural details that an architectural control committee or an ACC would be in charge of. And so that's one thing we put forth, but perhaps even more importantly than having a separate committee is the recommendation that you make very clear in your CC&Rs that these committees have the authority to adapt to landscaping best practices. We know that irrigation best practices are going to change. We know that plants are going to continue. Plant recommendations will change. And so having a committee with the flexibility to adapt is really important. And we provide some example language there. The next one, and I'm only excerpting a few, is sort of in line with this recommendation to keep your landscaping guidelines adaptable, is to only include non-negotiable rules in your covenants, conditions, and restrictions. These are things that you don't foresee changing ever in the future, really, and that you want to make sure are a core part of your development. And so as an example, one of the non-negotiable rules is that landscape irrigations shall not be mandatory. You really should customize this to your development, of course, but we do provide a couple examples like this one around irrigation systems. The last recommendation that we make for your CC&Rs, and that's, is to require common areas to showcase best practices. This is important because landscape guidelines that say an architectural control committee are in charge of don't apply to common areas usually. And so you want your CC&Rs to lay out what you want to see in common areas. And that includes, for example, here, having your species come from a local native plant society or your committee's approved plant list. All right. So those are your CC&Rs. Remember, harder to change. And then landscape guidelines. These are the ones that are promulgated or shared by an architectural control committee or perhaps the landscape design committee. This section of our guide is meant to be basically a template that you can use. We have it available for download on our website and that you can edit and use as your starting point for your own guidelines if you don't have them already or are looking to make updates. We cover a lot of different categories, and for the sake of time, we're not going to review them all, but I want to cover a couple that had a lot of discussion early on. The first is landscape planting. The recommendation is to choose native and drought tolerant plants for your landscaping. This is one of the easiest ways to conserve water and support local wildlife. And we've seen many cities that are adopting water-wise landscaping ordinances have a required plant list. So this is definitely a practice that's already in place at the municipal level, but could also be applied within an HOA. We provide a few example plant lists for folks to choose from. There's so many out there already, so we didn't go and create our own. The Grow Green Guide is one that is very commonly used, but I also want to point to the fact that GIA has a great manual as well with the plant list for the Edwards Aquifer. You have to scroll to the appendix, but definitely don't miss out on that one. When it comes to irrigation, we said this in up front with the CC&Rs. We tried to frame this as saying, the most water conservative approach is to not have irrigation with potable water. And when you have native landscapes, you can usually get away with not irrigating them, especially after the growing period once they're established. That said, we recognize that not all developments are going to feel comfortable moving forward without automatic irrigation, and that automatic irrigation does have its place. And so our approach to this guideline was to say, if you don't need it, it's better not to have it. But if you do need it, here are some practices that will help you save water. Those include things like hydrozoning your plants so that your irrigation schedules are matched to your plant needs. Having rain and freeze sensors, again, another thing we've seen many municipalities starting to require. Using drip irrigation instead of overhead sprinklers on plant beds. and making sure that your systems are scheduled in such a way that you're not overwatering. These guidelines are fairly extensive. These are also from best practices that we see in many other documents, including the TCEQ manual on irrigation best practices. And so we really, again, rather than trying to reinvent the wheel, pulled from what was already out there to present guidelines. When it comes to rainwater harvesting, we've seen and heard from folks that this can be a point of tension. Remember that with the 2013 change to the property code, you cannot enforce any part of your deed restrictions that would say that rainwater harvesting is not allowed. But some HOAs have very specific requirements that make it expensive or very difficult to put in place rainwater harvesting. And so our approach for this guideline was to make it as general as possible. You can have a rainwater harvesting system. It should be professionally designed, and these systems are encouraged. We refer to manuals that really talk about best practices with installing these systems. We say the installation should be neat and tidy, but we don't talk about the sorts of materials or placement or size restrictions. We do also encourage folks to consider irrigating landscapes with rainwater harvesting, but it's not a requirement, at least with these guidelines. The last one I'll spotlight is our landscape guideline around outdoor lighting. And again, we'll share that we have many resources for folks to learn about outdoor lighting. And here we're recommending that light fixtures used outside be fully shielded and pointed downward so that you're not letting light escape and potentially impact views of the night skies. I can't stress enough that these guidelines really are a starting point. We created this with a goal of making these palatable and easy to adopt for as many new developments and neighborhoods as possible. But there's certainly opportunities to take these further and to do more to protect our region's amazing resources. And so we do encourage, if you are in a community that wants to take these further, to look for opportunities to adapt the guidelines and further protect things. And we know, for example, there are some developments out there that have gone ahead and said that no potable water will be used for irrigation. So that's an example of something you might consider that our landscape guidelines don't say, but that we know some developments are looking at. All right, the last section of our guide is implementation. And we're really looking at a few different audiences, starting with developers. The first sort of ask that we make of new developers in this region is to preserve as much of our native landscape as possible when developing a site. We provide some resources in our guidebook for local volunteer groups that can come and collect seeds from native plants before you do any of your site grading, if that's something that's important to you. And like we said earlier, this is kind of outside of the scope of our guidelines, but we wanted to make sure to say there's a lot that can be done upfront when developing a property just to make sure our native landscapes are preserved. The second recommendation is to establish CC&Rs and landscape guidelines that are regionally specific and reflective of some of the real water supply challenges that we're seeing. And so we, again, are providing these resources as a starting point, and we hope that developers will find them helpful. And we're happy to work with folks, and we hope that folks working with developers will also find them helpful. And then the last thing is beyond water, which is definitely on the top of people's inboxes. If you're getting the news or updates from the legislature, water is definitely a hot topic. But our night sky views are also so important. And so anything that people can do to protect views of the night sky is so helpful. For cities, when it comes to implementation, one of our recommendations is to consider passing ordinances that encourage the preservation of water, land, and night skies. That could be a night skies ordinance, a water-wise landscaping ordinance. We have a great resource called Leading by Example on our website that's for cities to look at with examples of ordinances that other cities have put in place. This really, of course, is only going to address developments and HOAs within city limits, but it's a good way for cities to think about at large the sort of landscaping that they want to see moving forward. Another option that we've seen some cities take advantage of is creating tax incentives and rebate programs for homeowners that want to implement more low impact features on their properties. We recognize that this is expensive and might not be an option for every community, but the communities that do have this in place have seen success with folks installing more rainwater harvesting tanks or doing turf removal and replacing turf with more drought tolerant and adapted grasses. Our third recommendation to cities was to showcase low impact landscaping in public spaces, just to build awareness around the sort of beauty of these plants and these sorts of landscapes, and to be a model for new developments that are joining your communities. And then lastly, we suggest considering developer agreements as a way to encourage low impact landscaping as well. If you're a county or a GCD, you don't really have the same ordinances at your disposal that a city has, but you're still in a position to encourage new developments coming in, new community members coming in to adopt HOA CC&Rs and landscape guidelines that are protective of hill country natural resources. Often new developments in this part of the plotting process express intent for having an HOA or not. And so that's a good point to just share a document like this, or share a version of this document that just outlines what you'd love to see in the landscape. Like cities, you can demonstrate low impact landscaping in your county and GCD owned properties. And lastly, you can spotlight existing HOAs. So really leaning into education. And I'll share this example on the right-hand side. This is cheating a little bit. The Headwaters GCD in Kerr County shares an office space with UGRA, and UGRA has a really amazing model garden that folks are all interacting with when they come to UGRA, and as a result too when they visit the GCD. Last but not least, what about HOAs? So if you are living in an HOA, we also outline a list of recommendations and ways to implement this guide. The first step is, and many HOAs are already doing this, but just make sure that your HOA is in compliance with the changes to the Texas Property Code. So there really shouldn't be incidences of xeriscaping or rainwater harvesting being just point blank denied. Your HOA might have restrictions about what those things can look like and what sort of xeriscaping or rainwater harvesting is allowed. That's different from point blank denying it. But just, you want to make sure you're in compliance with the law. If you haven't already, and again, many HOAs have, but if you haven't already, it can be really helpful to update your landscaping guidelines. So create a policy, a new policy that is reflective of changes to the property code. One way to do that is to, and actually a critical step would be to, once you update your guidelines, file that policy change with the county. And really those guidelines should be clarifying what you want to see from rainwater harvesting tanks or drought tolerant landscapes. We emphasized earlier that this process should be transparent, and our guide talks about the sorts of informational sessions you might want to have available to residents to make sure that this is something that is being done with full transparency and with buy-in from the other residents of the HOA. Because most HOAs are not set up with a committee that is focused specifically on landscaping, so you don't have a landscape design committee usually, right? One of our recommendations was to try to set up a volunteer landscape committee that can really keep an eye on landscape guidelines to make sure that they're up to date with best practices. And to have this committee look at common area updates, because there's such a great opportunity to educate other residents. Usually you'll have one or two folks that are really motivated at least about landscaping. And so this could be a really great way to educate more residents. As an absolute last resort, if you need to amend your CC&Rs to allow for landscaping guidelines to be updated, then that is something that you'll want to work on, right? We say this as a last resort and if necessary, because they are so hard to change. And so the recommendation would be to do this only if you don't have the option through your board or architectural control committee to update your guidelines. So this is really something to look at with your lawyer as a last resort. Absolutely last, these are not easy changes to make. It takes a lot of resources and attention to shift your yard from something that looks like this to something that looks like this bottom image here. And so definitely celebrate progress that is made and investments that are made in these sorts of transformations. Our appendix has a couple of useful resources I want to point out. The first is that it has example language for a policy change. So if you're one of those HOAs that hasn't already filed a xeriscaping policy or a landscaping policy in response to the 2013 law change, we provide a template where you can go in and basically plug in your landscaping guidelines that you've written. We also have an extensive resource section. You saw earlier, we have resources on night skies, on native plants. We also have resources on irrigation and ways to understand your local water resources. So please check out all of those resources. I failed to mention here, and I want to make sure I don't miss it, that in addition to having a landscape policy template available for you to download from our website as a Word document and edit with your lawyer as you see fit, we've also made the landscape guidelines available as a Word document so that you can take these guidelines and adapt them for your HOA. So that template, again, is a Word document on our website ready for y'all to use and adapt. Okay, actually, the last thing is that if you are not living in an HOA or you're not interested in advocating to your city or county about this, there's still so much you can do just in your own backyard, regardless of what's happening at a policy level. We can each do our part to reduce our water footprint. I know a couple of our panelists are collecting our AC condensate with gallon buckets and using that to water our plants. So there's really so much we can each do in our own backyard. With that, I covered a ton of content. I see there's a lot of messages in the chat, and I want to make sure we have a lot of time to cover questions. And so I'll stop sharing my screen and we'll go to questions.
Marisa, we have someone with their hand raised. Dean Ike. I am not sure how to let someone come off.
Dean, you're off mute.
I think you should hear me now, I think.
Yep.
Okay. What was the question?
Oh, you had your hand raised, Dean, so that's why we called on you. But if you don't have
that was a spaz. I'm going down the highway trying to drive and listen to this at the same time. I'm a head of an ACC for our little 1,800 home subdivision in West Wimberley. And what I'm gathering from this, and correct me, is that because we're unincorporated and we're under a very active owners association, that the ACC has a good deal of latitude to implement or to consider your suggestions. Is that correct?
Yeah, it does depend on how your CC&Rs are written and whether you're delegated the authority to update landscape guidelines. In many cases, you are, but it's not 100% a rule, so you'd want to check on that. But if you are written in the way that many other HOAs are created and written, then you should have some ability to update your landscape guidelines with majority approval from your committee. Again, need to stress, definitely should be done transparently, but you do have that, you might have that authority. And Karen, maybe you can weigh in.
Yeah, you should have that authority. Check with your attorney. The other thing, there's a whole section in this guideline about if you're an existing HOA, how can you go about doing this? The other thing to understand in your HOA documents is whether you have the authority to enforce them. So there's two important pieces of this. One is you can either make recommendations, for what people should do, and that should be easy, right? Whether or not you have the
Right.
ability to enforce it is going to be dictated by your covenants.
Well, our enforcement is incredibly cumbersome and it's years long and expensive.
Yeah, then you're going to be best adopting it and encouraging it. Because you're
And
probably, were you guys incorporated like in the 60s or 70s or something?
well, yeah, deed restrictions were recorded in the mid-70s.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
there's a lot
those restrictions are pretty tough because restrictions back in the 60s and 70s didn't provide a lot of enforcement capability, and getting that enforcement capability is really hard because it does require a change in your covenants. Most covenants written starting in the late 80s and 90s have more enforcement capability than the stuff like I live in and you live in.
our ace in the hole on this is that we have I think 700 more lots to be developed. It's a subdivision that was stalled out repeatedly. And so the ACC has to consider these applications for new construction.
Very
And that is one point of influence that we have, an inflection point. But that's a good point about enforcement is different than creating rules. We do have the ability to issue architectural standards bulletins,
correct.
but all I can do is suggest procedures and so forth.
Yeah, but you do have some ability with new home construction with your architectural review process. And so that tends to be flexible. So you should use that as your lever for the new development.
Well, we intend to, but we have to get buy-in from everybody. And
Yeah.
the other thing is there's a sense of fairness that I like to employ. That's the reason I'm here doing this, because I can try to see both sides of the issue, and I can't be too draconian to the builders, but they want to enhance their property values too. And the comment about the xeriscape homes being potentially more valuable than irrigated traditional lawns is a point well taken. Certainly looking forward to getting some kind of presentation for our little homeowners association. I'll contact you on a sidebar for that. Thank you so much for the information.
Yeah, please
Thank
do.
you. I'm gonna keep us moving through some other questions. We had one come in that asked, do you have a draft landscape committee charter as a part of this product?
No, we don't have a draft landscape committee charter, at least not in full in our CC&R best practices. We have some examples of like rough language for, creating or starting or establishing a landscape design committee, but you would need more information about what their authorities are. CC&Rs, I'm sure you know, are extremely complex legal documents. And so that's why we didn't create those sort of multiple page documents. But Karen, maybe you can comment more on that too. And you're on mute.
Okay. Yeah, look, the other thing to look at in the documentation is we did establish some language that you might borrow from about the charter of the development itself, saying that whereas we wish to be an environmentally responsible, native plant friendly, night sky community, we're hereby adopting these CC&Rs. And so you may want to look at that language, but Marisa, that's probably something we can look at is what would it take to write a charter for a landscaping committee? I'm not sure it's a big deal, but we'll have to check with our attorney guys.
Yeah, great point, Karen. I'm gonna let Debbie ask her question next, but I do also just want to say that point about the 700 homes or lots that have not yet been built. That's a really huge opportunity. We know it's way easier to do your landscaping right from the beginning rather than having to go in and tear up your turf, and you've already invested money in that. And so really, if you have these lots that have not been developed, that have not yet invested in landscaping, that's a huge opportunity. Debbie, I'm gonna let you talk.
Hi. So I'm the president of the HOA in Steiner up in the front of the neighborhood because there's more than one. And we implemented a xeriscape plan last fall late and put it in our bylaws. And just for everybody's edification, I literally Googled xeriscape policies Austin, and there's any number of HOAs that already have them. And imitation is the best form of flattery. And so ours is actually a population of those and from City of Austin's native plants, etc. We cobbled it all together and put it in our bylaws and filed it with the county. And we have people who are and we made it part of our architectural committee review because we have a little bit of the growing pains that go along with it, that somebody went ahead and did their xeriscaping and didn't put any plan in. And it looks tough. I mean, it really looks bad. And so we're working with them, trying to get it to where it's a little more standardized and not just, big squares of empty dirt. And so, yes, it's been a learning process and we're trying to do the same within the common areas. So when the grass is dying, we're trying to come up with other alternatives to put it in play, except for, the parks and the areas that the turf is required. So like I said, Google searching xeriscape policies in Austin, I came up with lots and lots of opportunities, as Karen said, to borrow information. So, and I'm sure somebody paid somebody, a professional, an inordinate amount of money to create all that. And I apologize, but that's,
Oh, we looked at your xeriscaping policy, definitely. Steiner Ranch is a great example.
well, and we're only the front, so.
But the sections we did borrow, absolutely. Like I said, there's lots of HOAs that have already filed amazing xeriscaping policies. There's a lot to look at. This was our attempt to sort of pull from all of them and create something standard for places outside of Austin. But you're right, there's a lot of amazing examples to look at already out there. There was a question or a comment about showing folks our website really fast to show where you can find all of this. So if you go to hillcountryalliance.org/HOA guide, you can scroll and click here to view and download the full guide as a PDF. You can also access our templates. This is the link to download the landscaping policy change template. So this is what Debbie, you were just talking about. Y'all probably filed something that looked like this. And then a template for landscape guidelines that you could use. There was another question in the chat about whether we plan to engage with new developments coming in. And I can say, at least at a high level, yes, I think it's an enormous task and we're still figuring out what that engagement looks like, but it's definitely part of our plan for rollout. And we fully expect to do that in partnership with lots of grassroots groups that first reached out to us about this guide, some of our county partners. It's definitely not something that we can or would want to undertake alone. And I don't know, Catherine, if you have more to say on that.
Yeah, I'll just chime in that everyone on this call likely has something that they could contribute to this document. And as you mentioned, Marisa, in your disclaimers, we have a lot to learn about how to be helpful in shaping more water-wise development in the Hill Country, how to really spotlight those developments that are, as Marisa said, going above and beyond and really the shining example. And so we're excited to be in conversation with all of you, excited to hear how you pick up this document and shape it to be a good fit for your particular community. And then I'm sure we'll be adding on and making changes as we go along. So.
And I would also say we'd love anybody that's interested in helping with the outreach, because I think there is going to be a lot of outreach. And for those of you who've been down this path or have good examples to share and might be willing to work with Marisa and Amanda and myself on some of this like mind-boggling outreach, you should contact Marisa and tell her you're a very willing volunteer, because it would make her day.
All right, I'm looking to see There was a question about the 4 example cities mentioned. I know, Catherine, that you directed folks to check out Leading by Example. I can put the URL to that in the chat as well. But off the top of my head, I think they were City of Kyle, City of Georgetown, City of Austin, and City of San Marcos. And if you go to our guidebook, we link directly to the ordinance language, so you can pull from that. And I will put that in the chat right now. So I see that there are a lot of conversations happening, but are there any questions that folks want to come off mute for to ask in the last 6 minutes of this webinar?
Marisa, there was a question about outreach plans to go talk to cities and counties.
Yeah, so we have put out the alert to our city and county partners that this guide is out there, and that we're willing to work with cities and partners on the rollout. This is definitely still something that we're going to sort of, I think, learn trial by fire, how many resources we need to give. I think different cities have different levels of resources. Some cities will have a water conservation coordinator, some will not. And so we'll have to figure out the level of support that we're able to give, especially to cities that don't have the staff capacity to maybe have a targeted HOA outreach plan. And so many suggestions too about partnering with a master naturalist and the Native Plant Society of Texas. Absolutely. If you haven't heard from us yet, don't worry, you will. We absolutely see you all as partners in this. You all have so much expertise with native plants and adapted plants that we know will want to and that we'll need to lean on that expertise as part of the rollout of this guide. So many good ideas coming through about where to put this out. Like Karen said, if you're someone that feels excited and inspired about helping to roll this out, please shoot me an email. Definitely, this is a boots on the ground situation, especially if you live in an HOA and want to help organize a presentation. Please don't hesitate to email us. Okay, Leon, I see you. And I'm going to give you the ability to talk. And sorry for that framing. That is what it says in Zoom. You should be able to ask your question now.
Leon, you're on mute if you're able to come off.
I'm sorry, just wanted to make a comment to thank you for presenting this very current topics on conservation. I guess our situation can be explained in one sentence: 1 glass of water, more straws every day. Thank you.
That is true. And also, sort of a sad note to end on. So I will just say there are opportunities, to do more to conserve water. And as we grow and as we are potentially putting more stress on our some of our aquifers, there's also more that we can all be doing to cut back. And so it's not all doom and gloom. Okay, I think we've got time for one more question if anyone else wants to ask something. Okay. Well, if there are no more questions, I think that we'll wrap up and just say thank you so much again for taking your lunch hour to meet with us and to hear about this resource. Please don't hesitate to reach out if you're excited to roll this out and if you have feedback too on this resource. Catherine, Amanda, Karen, any last words you want to share?
I want to just give a shout out to both Amanda and Karen, who, Marisa, you complimented them as co-authors on this report. This report would not exist without your all's genius and the many, many hours contributed to creating it. So thank you so much as volunteers. We so appreciate it. And Marisa for pushing the rope up the hill, so to speak, on this resource. We really are excited. It's kind of finally coming to the starting line of entering, getting it out in the world. So thank you all.
Bye, everyone. Thank you so much.